The flight attendant stormed down the aisle, her eyes locked on a man sitting in first class. She didn't check his ticket. She didn't ask his name. She just stopped in front of him and said, "Sir, you need to move. Now." The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there watching her, calm, steady, waiting. Passengers turned their heads. Whispers started. The air in the cabin felt tense. But what the flight attendant didn't know? The man she was trying to kick off the plane was the owner of the airline, and in a few minutes she was going to regret everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The flight attendant walked through the narrow aisle of the plane, her sharp eyes scanning the first-class cabin. She carried herself with confidence, her uniform crisp, her hair pulled into a perfect bun. She had worked for the airline for years, long enough to know how things were supposed to run. First-class passengers were easy to spot. They dressed a certain way, carried themselves with a certain attitude, and never seemed out of place. But today, something felt off. Her gaze landed on a man seated near the window, comfortably adjusting his watch. He was tall, well-dressed, and relaxed, but something about him made her pause. He didn't fit the image she expected. His suit, though expensive, wasn't flashy. His shoes were polished but understated. He had the calm presence of someone who belonged, but for some reason she didn't believe he did. She moved closer, stopping beside his seat. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?" Her voice was polite, but there was an edge to it. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, handing it to her without a word. She barely glanced at it before handing it back. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of this seat," she continued. "First class is reserved for priority passengers." A few people nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. The man raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "This is my seat," he said simply. His voice was steady, even pleasant, but it carried weight. The flight attendant pressed her lips together. She had dealt with passengers like this before, people who thought they could talk their way into an upgrade, who acted like they belonged where they didn't. She wasn't going to let it happen today. "I don't know how you got this ticket," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "but I need you to move to economy before we take off." The man didn't argue. He looked at her for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. He placed the device back in his lap and folded his hands together. "I'll wait right here," he said. The flight attendant frowned. This was supposed to be quick. Usually when she asked someone to move, they complied, but this man wasn't budging. She straightened her shoulders, knowing she had the authority to call security if needed. The last thing she wanted was a scene, but she wasn't about to let a mistake go unchecked. Passengers whispered among themselves. Some exchanged curious glances, while others pretended not to notice. The man remained calm, not looking at anyone, just waiting. A few minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. "Flight attendant, please report to the cockpit immediately." The announcement made her stomach tighten. The captain rarely called her unless something urgent had come up. She gave the man one last look before turning on her heel and walking briskly toward the front of the plane. She stepped into the cockpit, where the captain was waiting with a serious expression. The in-flight phone was still in his hand, and on the screen behind him was a video call with someone from corporate. "Did you remove a passenger from first class?" the person on the screen asked. Their voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind their words. The flight attendant lifted her chin. "Yes," she said, "he didn't belong there." The person on the screen paused for a moment, then spoke again. "You just removed the owner of this airline." The words hit her like a sudden drop in turbulence. The owner? That couldn't be right. She had seen wealthy passengers before, executives, celebrities, politicians, but the man sitting in 3A hadn't carried himself like one of them. He had been too quiet, too unbothered, too ordinary. She felt the weight of the captain's stare, the silence in the cockpit stretching too long. The voice on the other end didn't wait for her to recover. "Do you realize what you've just done?" The tone was even, but there was something sharp underneath it. "You removed the owner of this airline from his own seat, without checking the manifest, without confirming his ticket. You made a judgment based on what, exactly?" The flight attendant's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her mind raced for an explanation, a justification, something to make this moment less disastrous than it already was. I thought there was a mistake," she finally stammered. "He didn't look like he was supposed to be there." The second the words left her mouth, she regretted them. The captain exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated. The corporate representative leaned forward slightly, their expression unreadable. "So you assumed he didn't belong in first class, and rather than verify his ticket, you humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of passengers?" The realization sank in, slow and suffocating. Her legs felt weak. She had prided herself on being one of the best in her crew, on keeping things in order, on making sure everything ran smoothly. But in her attempt to enforce the rules, she had broken one of the biggest ones. Never assume, always confirm. "We'll be discussing your actions when this flight lands," the voice continued. "But for now, you will return to first class, apologize, and personally escort him back to his seat." The flight attendant's stomach twisted. She had never been asked to publicly correct herself before. Passengers didn't question her authority. She was the one who gave instructions, not the one who took them. And now, she was expected to walk back into that cabin and admit, in front of everyone, that she had been wrong. The captain said nothing, only giving her a small nod toward the door. The conversation was over. There was no argument to be made. She swallowed hard, turned, and made her way back down the aisle, every step heavier than the last. As she approached the first-class section, she saw the man still seated where she had left him. He hadn't moved, hadn't caused a scene, hadn't even reacted when she had tried to push him out. He had simply waited. And now, as she stopped beside him, the attention of every nearby passenger shifted to her. Her voice, usually strong and confident, felt foreign in her own throat. "Sir," she said, her words slower than usual, "there's been a misunderstanding." The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. The flight attendant could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze pressing down on her. She had never been in this position before, having to admit she was wrong, having to retract her own authority in front of an audience. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the seat in front of her, steadying herself. The man looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't reacted with anger when she first told him to move. He hadn't caused a commotion or raised his voice. But now, his silence spoke louder than anything she had expected. He was waiting, not for an excuse, not for an explanation, just for the truth. She cleared her throat and forced the words out. "I was mistaken. This is your seat. I apologize for the misunderstanding." There was no warmth in her voice, no sincerity, just a stiff, forced apology that barely covered the humiliation she had put him through. She expected him to take the easy way out, to nod, accept the apology, and move on. Instead, he leaned back slightly, studying her. "A misunderstanding." His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge to it now. "That's what you're calling it?" A few passengers shifted in their seats, sensing that this conversation wasn't over. The flight attendant felt her stomach tighten. "Yes," she said quickly, eager to end this. "It was a mistake, and I'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class." But he didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving her. "Let me ask you something," he said. "When you first saw me sitting here, what exactly did you think was wrong?" The question made her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected him to challenge her like this, to make her explain herself. She had assumed she could smooth this over with a half-hearted apology and move on. But now he was forcing her to confront it. She hesitated for too long. His expression didn't change, but his next words cut through the silence. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class to show their ticket. Just me." She opened her mouth to protest, to say something, anything, But the words never came, because she knew he was right. The realization burned in her chest. The man exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You weren't following policy," he continued. "You weren't enforcing a rule. You made a decision the second you looked at me." The whispers among the passengers grew louder. Some looked away, embarrassed to have witnessed it. Others watched intently, waiting to see how she would respond. The flight attendant swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. She had spent years perfecting her ability to control situations like these, to handle difficult passengers, to maintain authority, but she wasn't in control now. The man finally reached for his seatbelt and unbuckled it. He stood up slowly, his presence somehow feeling even larger than before. But instead of following her to first class, he did something she wasn't expecting. He took his phone out, typed something quickly, then put it away. Then he looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Let's see what happens when we land." And with that, he walked back to his seat, without her. The flight attendant stood frozen in place, her heart pounding. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to nod, accept the apology, and let the moment pass. Instead, he had turned the tables. He wasn't looking for a simple apology. He wanted accountability. Passengers murmured quietly, their voices blending into a low hum. Some stared at her, while others quickly turned away, pretending not to witness her embarrassment. She had never felt this exposed before. The authority she had always carried so easily now felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. He had sent a message. To who? The corporate office? A lawyer? Her supervisor? The weight of her actions settled heavier on her chest. Inside the galley, another flight attendant, a younger woman, looked up from arranging drinks. She'd been watching from a distance, not saying a word. But now there was something in her eyes, something close to pity. "That didn't go how you expected, did it?" she said, her voice careful. The older flight attendant stiffened. "Mind your own business." The younger woman didn't push. She simply tilted her head. "You do know who he is, right?" Silence. The flight attendant swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. She didn't answer. She didn't want to, because deep down she already knew. Meanwhile, in first class, the man settled back into his seat, adjusting his cufflinks as if nothing had happened. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. If anything, he looked patient, like someone waiting for something inevitable. He glanced at his phone again. The message had been received. At the front of the plane, the cockpit door opened slightly, and the captain stepped out. His eyes swept the cabin before landing on the man in seat 3A. He gave a small nod, one of recognition, one of understanding. Then, without a word, he stepped back inside. Something was about to happen. And for the flight attendant, the real turbulence was only just beginning. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but inside the flight attendant's head, everything was loud. Her heartbeat, the whispers of passengers, the silent weight of her mistake pressing against her ribs. She had never felt this unsettled before, never had a passenger throw her off balance like this. She needed to regain control, to steady herself. She took a deep breath and reached for a tray of drinks, forcing herself to focus on the routine tasks that had always come easily. But her hands weren't steady. The ice in the glasses clinked too loudly, her grip on the tray too tight. She didn't like feeling powerless. She glanced toward first class, expecting the man to still be looking at her, expecting some smug satisfaction in his expression. But he wasn't paying her any attention at all. He was calm, composed, scrolling through his phone, completely unbothered. That made it worse. She turned to the younger flight attendant, trying to keep her voice level. "What do you mean? Do I know who he is?" The younger woman hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I didn't realize it at first, but when the captain walked out just now, that confirmed it." She gave a knowing look. "He's not just some businessman. He owns this airline." The words struck like a punch to the gut. The flight attendant's fingers curled around the tray as her stomach twisted. She wanted to argue, to deny it, to insist that it wasn't possible. But the moment she replayed everything in her head, his calm demeanor, the way he didn't fight back, the way he simply waited, it all made sense. No wonder he didn't react the way other passengers did. No wonder he didn't argue or demand his seat back. He had known all along that the moment would come when the truth would set itself right. He hadn't needed to prove anything to her. She had humiliated the most powerful man in the company she worked for. And now, she had no idea what was coming next. The younger attendant watched her closely. He texted someone. I don't know who, but if I were you, I'd be worried. The flight attendant clenched her jaw, her mind spinning through possibilities. There was no way he was just going to let this go. Would he fire her immediately? Would she even make it to the end of the flight before security met her at the gate? A sudden crackle from the intercom made her stiffen. Flight attendants, prepare for final cabin check before landing. She looked at the clock above the galley. Had time really passed that fast? They were beginning their descent, meaning she only had minutes before this flight was over. Minutes before she stepped off the plane and faced whatever was waiting for her. With her breath shaky, she smoothed out her uniform, pushed the tray back into its slot, and stepped into the aisle. Passengers avoided eye contact as she passed, but she felt their stares anyway. Some had their heads buried in their phones, probably already typing out social media posts about what had happened. Others whispered to their seatmates, their words just low enough that she couldn't make them out. And then there was him, seated in 3A, still perfectly composed, one hand resting on the armrest, the other tapping something out on his phone. He didn't even glance at her when she walked by. She hated how that made her feel. She stopped beside him, forcing herself to speak. Sir, would you like anything before landing? Her voice was clipped, controlled. It was the last bit of dignity she had left, offering a forced courtesy before this flight was over. This time, he did look at her. His gaze was unreadable, his expression as calm as ever. Then slowly he smiled. No, he said simply. I have everything I need. Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. The rest of the descent felt like it stretched for hours. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last. By the time the wheels touched down and the plane began taxiing to the gate, the flight attendant's hands were ice cold. Then the intercom buzzed again. But this time the message was different. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated as we have a special crew matter to handle before deplaning. A few passengers frowned, exchanging confused glances. The flight attendant, however, felt her stomach drop. This was about her. She knew it was. She turned toward the front of the plane, and as she did, she spotted movement outside the window. Airport security officers were already waiting at the gate. Her breath caught in her throat. The plane had landed. But for her, the free fall was just beginning. The flight attendant's chest tightened as the plane rolled to a stop. The announcement had settled over the cabin like a dense fog, thick with uncertainty. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves, glancing toward the front where uniformed security officers stood just beyond the jet bridge window. She gripped the back of a seat, trying to steady herself. No one had said her name, but she knew. She felt it. This wasn't about a security issue with a passenger. This wasn't a random protocol check. This was about her. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Normally, this was the moment where people leapt to their feet, eager to grab their bags and get off the plane. But this time, no one moved. The air felt heavier, charged with silent anticipation. The cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the man in seat 3A. The two exchanged a brief nod, silent communication passing between them. Then the captain finally turned toward her. "Step into the galley," he instructed, his voice low but firm. The knot in her stomach pulled tighter, but she forced herself to move. Her legs felt stiff, her hands clammy. She had handled difficult passengers before. She had stood her ground in tense situations. But nothing, not in all her years working for this airline, had ever felt like this. The second she stepped into the galley, she spotted another familiar face waiting for her. A man in a dark gray suit holding a tablet in one hand, his stance firm. The airline's senior operations manager. The moment she saw him, her mouth went dry. She had heard his name whispered among the crew before. He was the kind of executive you only met when things had gone very wrong. He didn't waste time. What happened on this flight? She straightened her posture, trying to gather her thoughts. There was a misunderstanding with a first-class passenger. I handled it. The operations manager's gaze was sharp. You handled it? He swiped his tablet screen, then turned it so she could see. Her stomach turned to ice. On the screen was a passenger complaint report, but not just any report. Multiple complaints, submitted mid-flight, some from passengers, some from the flight crew. Every single one detailed the exact same thing. Her unfair treatment of the man in 3A. Her throat went dry. But the operations manager cut her off. You removed a first-class passenger from his seat without verifying his ticket. You failed to follow standard protocol. You escalated the situation unnecessarily. And most importantly, the man you removed was not just a passenger. He was the owner of this airline. She knew all of this already, but hearing it said out loud, with authority, with finality, made her knees weak. I made a mistake, she said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. I understand that now. The operations manager didn't respond right away. He studied her, his fingers drumming against the side of the tablet. Then he asked the one question she had been dreading. Why did you assume he didn't belong in first class? Her pulse pounded in her ears. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She couldn't answer. Because deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't asked anyone else for their ticket. She hadn't questioned any of the other first-class passengers. She had looked at him, made an assumption, and acted on it without thinking. And now, that single moment of bias, one she had barely even considered at the time, was costing her everything. The operations manager let the silence stretch for a moment, then exhaled, shaking his head. Mr. Carter has already sent a formal request for an incident review. That means this isn't just being handled internally. He lowered the tablet. As of now, you are suspended from duty pending a full investigation. The words felt distant, like they were being spoken to someone else. Suspended. She had spent years working for this airline, years climbing the ranks, enforcing the rules, making sure everything was done right. And now it was all crumbling. The reality of it hit her all at once. Her mouth felt dry. Her hands shook. Please, she said, her voice quieter now. Is there anything I can do? The operations manager was already stepping aside, motioning toward the waiting security officers. You'll be escorted off the aircraft, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You'll receive further instructions once the review is complete. Panic gripped her chest. She turned, eyes searching the cabin, looking for something, someone to back her up. But no one spoke for her. The passengers who had once looked away awkwardly were watching now. Some with mild satisfaction, others with quiet judgment. And then her eyes landed on him. The man in 3A, still seated, still calm. Watching her, not gloating, not angry, just watching. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo what had already been done. But the look in his eyes told her everything. There was nothing left to say. One of the security officers stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, voice firm but professional. It's time to go. Her throat tightened. She took one last shaky breath, straightened her uniform as if that could somehow fix everything, and stepped forward. The walk down the aisle felt longer than it ever had before. Each step felt heavier. The whispers followed her, the stares burned into her back. She had boarded this plane with authority, with control, with certainty in her place in the world. Now she was walking off as nothing more than a cautionary tale. She reached the exit, the cold air of the jet bridge hitting her skin as she stepped off the plane. Behind her the cabin remained silent, and just like that, her flight was over. She stepped onto the jet bridge, her legs unsteady, her hands cold. The usual rush of flight attendants preparing for the next boarding, the hum of passengers re-entering the terminal. None of it felt real. It was as if the entire world had zoomed out, and she was watching herself from a distance, a figure walking toward an uncertain fate. The security officers walked beside her, neither rushing her nor offering comfort. They weren't here to arrest her. She wasn't a criminal. But the weight of their presence made it clear. She had crossed a line, and there was no slipping past this unnoticed. As they neared the terminal doors, the whisper of wheels against the floor made her glance to the side. A black-suited airport executive was approaching, a tablet in his hands. He nodded at security, then turned to her. "Come with me," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "We need to discuss the next steps." She had no choice. She followed him down a restricted hallway, away from the crowds. Every step echoed against the polished floors, each one pulling her further from the job, the authority, and the identity she had spent years building. Finally, they entered a private conference room, small, sterile, with a long table in the middle. The executive gestured for her to sit, then took a seat across from her. He placed his tablet down, exhaled, and steepled his fingers. "You understand why you're here," he said, not phrasing it as a question. She nodded, even though she wasn't sure she fully did. She knew she had made a mistake. She knew she had assumed, acted without thinking, embarrassed the wrong person. But what she didn't know was what exactly was going to happen next. "I need to be clear about something," he continued. "This isn't just about what happened on the plane. It's about what it represents." She swallowed. Let me finish." His tone was firm, and she fell silent. "You didn't just remove a passenger from first class," he said. "You made a snap judgment about who belonged there. You escalated a situation that never should have existed. You embarrassed a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. And that man, he wasn't just anyone." The lump in her throat grew tighter. "He was Malcolm Carter, the CEO and majority owner of this airline. The man whose name is printed on the very planes you work on. The man who could end your career with a single phone call." She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. The executive leaned forward. "Do you understand the magnitude of this? This isn't just a bad customer service incident. This is national news waiting to happen. This is an HR disaster. This is a lawsuit if he decides to push it that far. And right now, the only reason this isn't already all over the media is because he hasn't decided what to do with you yet." She felt lightheaded. She had always been careful, always followed the rules, always maintained control. And now, in just a few hours, she had destroyed everything. "He hasn't made a decision," she echoed weakly. The executive sighed. "Not yet, but he will." He slid his tablet toward her. On the screen was a formal suspension notice, waiting for her signature. "As of now, you are on unpaid suspension pending further review," he said. "This means you are not allowed on any company property, you are not to wear your uniform, and you will not be receiving any assignments until Mr. Carter makes his decision." Her breath hitched. "You're saying I could still lose my job?" He gave her a long look. "I'm saying that right now, you have lost your job. Whether you get it back is up to him." She felt her stomach drop. She had never imagined this moment, never thought she would be sitting in a cold conference room, waiting for a verdict on her entire career. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that she knew how things worked, that she knew how to handle passengers. But now none of that mattered. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the executive asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say? That she had been enforcing rules? That she had just been doing her job? That she hadn't meant anything by it? None of that would change the truth. She had looked at a man in first class, assumed he didn't belong, and acted accordingly. And now, she was paying the price for it. Her eyes dropped to the tablet. The words "unpaid suspension" blurred for a moment before she reached out and pressed her fingertip against the screen, signing her name. The executive nodded, retrieved the device, and stood. "You'll be escorted out of the airport. HR will be in touch." She remained in her seat as he walked out, her body feeling disconnected from her mind. The door opened again, and the security officers from earlier stepped inside. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice careful, "it's time to go." She forced herself to her feet. As she walked through the quiet hallways of the airport, past crew members who averted their eyes, past employees who had once greeted her with respect, the weight of reality settled over her. She had boarded the plane this morning as someone important. She was leaving as someone no one wanted to be. She stepped into the main terminal, her footsteps muffled by the polished tile floor. The air felt different out here, colder, heavier, filled with something she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just the weight of what had happened on the plane. It was the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. Passengers bustled around her, hurrying to their gates, pulling luggage behind them, chatting on phones. The normal rhythm of the airport continued, completely indifferent to the fact that her career was hanging by a thread. She had walked through this terminal thousands of times before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't a flight attendant. She wasn't part of the crew. She was just another person walking toward an uncertain future. The security officers stopped near the exit doors, their job complete. One of them hesitated before speaking. "Do you need a ride home?" His tone was neutral, but there was something close to pity in his eyes. She forced herself to shake her head. "I'll be fine." He nodded and stepped back, allowing her to walk out on her own. The moment she stepped outside, the cool air hit her skin like a slap. The usual chaos of arriving and departing passengers surrounded her. Honking taxis, travelers rushing toward baggage claim, families reuniting. But she didn't belong to any of it. Her hands clenched into fists. How had this happened? Just hours ago, she'd been standing in the first-class cabin, fully in control, commanding respect. She had been confident in her authority, certain that she knew exactly how things were supposed to work. And now? Now she was suspended, her reputation shattered, her future in someone else's hands. And that someone was him, Malcolm Carter, the man she had tried to remove from first class, the man who had let her humiliate herself, let her escalate the situation, let her walk straight into her own downfall. And yet he had never once raised his voice, never once argued, never once lost control. He had played the long game, and she had walked right into it. Her stomach twisted as she thought about what he might do next. He hadn't fired her yet, but that didn't mean he wouldn't. He had every right to. He could make an example out of her, show the entire company and the world that this kind of treatment wouldn't be tolerated. But something about his silence bothered her more than the possibility of losing her job. If he had wanted to humiliate her, he could have done it right there on the plane. He could have exposed her in front of the passengers, let her be escorted off in front of everyone. But he hadn't. He had watched, waited, made her sit with the weight of what she had done. And now, she was waiting for him. She glanced at her phone, half expecting to see an email from the airline, a termination notice, a final decision. But there was nothing. Just the suspension order sitting in her inbox like a bomb waiting to go off. She exhaled sharply and turned toward the curb, flagging down a cab. As she climbed inside and closed the door, her mind raced with possibilities. Would he fire her? Would he push for legal action? Would she ever be able to work in the airline industry again? Or would he make her face what she had done in a way she hadn't expected? The cab pulled away from the airport, merging onto the highway, but her thoughts stayed firmly locked on the man in seat 3A. Because whatever happened next wasn't just about her job. It was about whether she would ever be able to look at herself the same way again. The cab ride home felt longer than it should have. The city blurred past her, but she barely noticed the streets she had driven down 100 times before. Her thoughts kept circling the same thing. The moment everything had changed, the moment she had looked at him, assumed he didn't belong, and acted on that assumption without a second thought. Her grip tightened around her phone as she refreshed her email for the 10th time. But there was still nothing. No update. No final decision. Just silence. Maybe that was the worst part. If Malcolm Carter had fired her immediately, it would have been painful, humiliating, but at least she would have known her fate. Instead, he had left her in limbo, making her sit with the weight of her actions, making her wonder why he was waiting. Was it deliberate? Was he letting her stew in her own mistakes, forcing her to acknowledge what she had done before he made his final move? Or was he considering something else? Something worse? Her fingers hovered over her phone screen. Should she send an apology? Would it even matter at this point? She had apologized on the plane, but it hadn't been real. She had been trying to save face, trying to fix the situation as quickly as possible so she could move on. But now she wasn't sure if there was even a way to fix this. The cab pulled up in front of her apartment complex. She paid the driver without a word and stepped out, the crisp evening air wrapping around her like a warning. She climbed the stairs to her unit, her hands shaking slightly as she unlocked the door. Inside, everything was the same as she had left it that morning. Her uniform jacket draped over the back of the couch, her work bag sitting by the door, ready for another shift that now might never come. She stood there for a long moment, staring at it. Her entire life had revolved around this job. The early morning flights, the long layovers, the rush of the airport, the control she had over the cabin. It had been her identity. And now, it felt like it had been ripped away in a matter of minutes. She sank onto the couch and dropped her phone onto the coffee table, rubbing her face with both hands. The silence of her apartment was suffocating, pressing down on her like the weight of all the choices that had led her here. She had always believed she was fair, that she treated all passengers the same, enforced the same rules, held everyone to the same standard. But that wasn't true, was it? Because when she had looked at him, Malcolm Carter, her first instinct hadn't been to check the manifest or confirm his ticket. It had been to assume. She had spent years enforcing the rules, making snap judgments about passengers, deciding who deserved what treatment before they even spoke. And maybe this was the first time it had backfired in such a spectacular way. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't the first time she had done it. It was just the first time she had done it to the wrong person. Her stomach twisted. Maybe that was the real punishment. Not the suspension. Not the possible termination. But the fact that she had to sit here, alone, and face the kind of person she had become. Her phone vibrated on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her breath hitched as she reached for it, half expecting to see an email from the airline, her final judgment. But it wasn't an email. It was a text. And when she saw the name attached to it, her hands went cold. Malcolm Carter. She stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. She had never expected to hear from him directly. The fact that he had her number at all made her skin prickle. She hesitated, then tapped the message open. "I want to meet tomorrow, 10 a.m., my office." That was it. No explanation, no details, just a command. Her stomach clenched. She had no idea if this was going to be her chance to save herself, or the final nail in her career's coffin. Either way, she knew one thing. Tomorrow she was going to have to face the man she had humiliated. And whatever he had planned for her, she wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of it. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the moment in the first-class cabin, the way she had spoken to him, the way he had calmly watched her, the way her own authority had crumbled in her hands before she even realized what was happening. Her mind kept spinning with questions. What did he want? Why was he calling her in? If he was going to fire her, wouldn't he have done it already? But then again, Malcolm Carter didn't strike her as the kind of man who made rash decisions. He had let her unravel on that flight, let her walk herself into a mess without needing to raise his voice or demand anything. He had simply waited. Now, she was the one waiting. When her alarm finally went off at 7 a.m., she felt like she had been awake for hours. She moved on autopilot, getting dressed in a simple blouse and slacks. No uniform, not anymore. The silence of her apartment felt different today, heavier. She had spent years waking up to prepare for flights, checking schedules, making sure she was on time for her crew. But today, she wasn't going to the airport. She was going to face the man who could end her career with a single sentence. The drive to the airline's corporate office was shorter than she expected, Traffic moved faster than usual, or maybe she was just so lost in thought that she didn't register the stops and turns. When she pulled into the parking garage, she just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm the nerves twisting in her stomach. The office building loomed ahead of her, sleek and modern, the airline's name displayed in bold letters across the front. She had been here once before, for training, for briefings, but never like this, never summoned. Taking a shaky breath, she forced herself to step out of the car. Inside, the lobby was all glass and polished floors, employees moving quickly, dressed in crisp business attire. No one paid her any attention, but she felt exposed, like she didn't belong here. She approached the receptionist, who barely glanced up before nodding toward the elevators. "Mr. Carter is expecting you. Top floor." The ride up felt like the longest 30 seconds of her life. With every floor she passed, she felt the weight of what was coming press harder against her chest. When the doors finally slid open, she stepped into a quiet, open office space. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, giving a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The decor was minimal but expensive, every piece of furniture chosen with precision. And then, there he was. Malcolm Carter sat behind a sleek black desk, dressed in a tailored navy suit, calm as ever. He wasn't staring at her with anger, wasn't holding a termination letter, wasn't even checking his watch like she was wasting his time. He simply looked at her, waiting. Her throat felt dry. "You wanted to see me?" He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." She hesitated for half a second before lowering herself into the chair, her hands pressed against her lap to keep them from shaking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Tell me," he said, his voice as steady as it had been on the flight. "Why do you think you're here?" The question felt like a test. She swallowed. Because I made a mistake." He didn't blink. "What mistake?" She knew this was another test. He wasn't going to feed her answers. He was going to make her say it. "I assumed something about you that I shouldn't have," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I looked at you and decided you didn't belong in first class before I even checked. I didn't follow protocol. I didn't verify anything. I just assumed." Her own words tasted bitter in her mouth. Malcolm nodded slightly, as if that answer had been expected, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into a folder on his desk, pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it across to her. She stared at it for a moment before picking it up. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a passenger complaint report. Not just about the incident with him, but others. Different flights, different passengers. Some were anonymous, others had names. Each one detailed moments where she had questioned passengers about their seats, challenged their upgrades, or spoken in a way that made them feel they weren't welcome in first class. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know there were complaints." Malcolm exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. "No, you didn't, because no one ever pushed it this far before." She clenched her hands together, trying to find the words, but nothing came. "You know what I think?" he continued, his tone still calm. "I don't think you're a bad flight attendant. I don't think you wake up every day looking for someone to target. But I do think you've been doing this so long that you stopped questioning yourself. You stopped seeing the pattern." She swallowed hard. "You thought you were just enforcing rules," he said. "But those rules seem to apply to certain people more than others, didn't they?" She wanted to deny it, wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she had always been professional, that she had always treated passengers fairly. But the evidence was right in front of her. She had seen it happen before, in others. She had whispered about it with her co-workers, rolled her eyes at older flight attendants who clearly treated some passengers differently than others. But she had never thought she was one of them. Malcolm let the silence stretch, watching her carefully. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You're suspended," he said. "That won't change. But whether or not you come back to this airline..." He folded his hands together. That depends on what you do next. Her pulse pounded. What do you mean? He tilted his head slightly. You have a choice. You can walk out of here, wait for HR to process your termination and never work in this industry again. Or, he let the word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. You can take accountability, not just for me, not just for that flight, but for all of it. You can look at what you've done, see where you went wrong, and actually fix it. She stared at him, unsure if she was breathing anymore. You want a second chance? He asked. Then prove you deserve one. Her mouth felt dry. How? He reached into another folder, pulled out a document, and placed it in front of her. It wasn't a termination letter. It was an enrollment form, bias training, mandatory courses. An entire program designed to retrain employees on how to identify and correct unconscious discrimination in the workplace. Her chest felt tight. She had never expected this. Not a firing, not a lecture, a choice. She looked up at him, unsure of what to say. Malcolm met her eyes, his gaze steady. Sign it, he said, or walk out. Your call. The weight of everything settled on her shoulders. Her entire future. Everything she had worked for, everything she thought she knew. It all came down to what she did next. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the paper. She wasn't sure if it was from nerves, embarrassment, or the sheer weight of what this moment meant. She scanned the words on the page, her mind racing. Bias training, diversity and inclusion courses, 6 months of monitored performance review, mandatory reassessment before reinstatement. She swallowed hard. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was a reset, a demand that she start over, unlearn habits she hadn't even realized she had, and prove that she could do better. She didn't know how to feel about that. Malcolm Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze unreadable. He wasn't pressing her. He wasn't rushing her. He was just waiting, the same way he had waited on the plane, letting her make her own mistake, letting her walk into her own downfall. And now he was letting her decide what came next. Her throat felt tight. Why are you giving me this chance? She asked, her voice quiet. His expression didn't change. Because I don't believe in throwing people away for one mistake. One mistake. She wanted to believe that this had been just one mistake, that this wasn't who she was, that she wasn't the kind of person who judged people unfairly, who treated passengers differently based on an assumption, who enforced rules selectively without even realizing it. But the complaint reports sitting on his desk told a different story, and for the first time, she couldn't ignore them. Her stomach twisted as she forced herself to speak again. If I say no, Malcolm exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the desk. Then this meeting is over. You'll get a formal termination letter within the week. The finality in his voice sent a chill down her spine. She thought about walking out, about the possibility of applying to another airline, starting fresh somewhere new. Maybe this wouldn't follow her. Maybe no one would find out what had happened. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wouldn't be able to shake this because even if another airline took her, she would still be her, still be the same flight attendant who had let her assumptions dictate her actions, still be the person who had needed to be caught before she realized what she had been doing all along. She took a shaky breath. 6 months? He nodded. 6 months. If you complete the program, pass the evaluations, and show actual growth, you'll get a chance to return, but only if you earn it. Her eyes flickered back to the document in front of her. The letters blurred together for a moment. This was humiliating. She had never been put in a position like this before. She had always been confident in her authority, in her ability to do her job. Now that confidence was gone, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. She picked up the pen and pressed it to the paper, signing her name. The second she finished, she let out a shaky breath, setting the pen down. Malcolm took the document, glanced at her signature, then neatly placed it back in the folder. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no smugness, no "I told you so." Just quiet finality. You start next week, he said. HR will send you the details. She nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. Malcolm watched her for a moment, then tilted his head slightly. "Why did you do it?" Her stomach tightened. She could have lied. She could have said she had been following protocol, that she had made a simple mistake, that she had just been trying to do her job. But they both knew that wasn't the truth. She hesitated, then swallowed. "Because I saw you and assumed you weren't supposed to be there." Her own words made her want to shrink. Saying them out loud, admitting it, made everything feel even heavier. Malcolm didn't react right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Do you know how many times that's happened to me?" Her breath caught in her throat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Do you know how many times I've walked into a first-class cabin and had someone assume I didn't belong? How many times I've been asked to prove I had the right to be there? How many times people have looked at me and decided, before I even said a word, that I must have been in the wrong seat?" She didn't move. She couldn't. "I've lost count," he said simply. The weight of his words settled over her like a stone. She had never thought about it like that, never considered how her one action, her one decision, was part of a pattern that had happened to him so many times that he didn't even look surprised when it happened again. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a mistake that people like him had to deal with every single day. Her throat burned. "I'm sorry." Malcolm studied her, then nodded slightly. "Good. Now prove it." She knew he didn't just mean prove it to him. She had to prove it to herself. She stood, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. "I won't waste this chance." Malcolm didn't reply right away. He just gave her a small nod, dismissing her. She turned and walked toward the door, her hand still slightly unsteady. As she reached for the handle, she hesitated, looking back. He was already focused on something else, flipping through another document, moving on with his day. Because for him, this wasn't the biggest moment of his life. It was just another Tuesday. But for her, it was the moment she realized she had been living in a world that had never truly challenged her to see. And now, she had to decide whether she was strong enough to change. She opened the door and stepped out, the hallway stretching in front of her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what came next. But maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. She stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. The office space around her felt strangely distant, as if she were walking through a place she no longer recognized. The employees who passed by barely glanced at her. To them, she was nobody. Just another person moving through the building, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. For the first time in her career, she understood what that felt like. She walked toward the elevator in a daze, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. The suspension, the training, the choice Malcolm Carter had given her. The weight of her own actions sat heavily in her chest, pressing down like a stone she couldn't shake. As she reached the elevator, she pressed the button and stared at the closed doors, watching her own reflection in the sleek metal. Who was she now? The woman who had walked onto that plane yesterday morning had been confident, self-assured, certain in her authority, certain in the way she saw the world. That woman had believed she was just doing her job, following protocol, keeping order. But that woman had also made assumptions. That woman had humiliated a man without hesitation, without question. That woman had never once stopped to think that her version of order might not be as fair as she had always believed. And now, that woman was gone. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The descent was slow, each floor passing by with quiet finality. She gripped the railing, breathing deeply, trying to ground herself. She wasn't sure if she had just saved her career or prolonged its death. The training program Malcolm had offered her wasn't just a formality. It was a test, a challenge, a way for him to see if she was capable of changing, of growing, of actually understanding what she had done wrong. But what scared her the most wasn't the idea of failing. It was the realization that she might not be the person she thought she was. The doors opened into the lobby, and she stepped out, blinking against the bright natural light streaming through the glass walls. The air smelled of fresh coffee and clean floors, the usual airport-like sterility of corporate buildings. She moved through the space without direction, her feet carrying her toward the exit, her thoughts tangled in knots. She had spent years believing she knew how the world worked, but Malcolm had forced her to see something she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. She had been comfortable in her authority, too comfortable. She had always assumed that she was fair, that she wasn't like the others, that she enforced the rules evenly, without bias, without prejudice. But deep down, had that ever been true? How many times had she questioned passengers who looked like they didn't belong? How many times had she passed over others who fit the image she expected? How many times had she made decisions without even realizing that she was playing into the same patterns, the same quiet injustices she had convinced herself she was above? She had never thought of herself as the problem, but maybe, in small ways, she had been part of it all along. Her hands clenched at her sides as she stepped through the sliding glass doors into the crisp morning air. The city was waking up around her, people hurrying down the sidewalks, taxis honking, the usual rhythm of life moving forward. For everyone else, today was just another day. For her, it was the beginning of something else. She didn't know what it would look like yet. She only knew that she couldn't go back to who she had been before. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before pulling it out, expecting another email from HR or some official update on her suspension. But it wasn't from the airline. It was a text from one of the other flight attendants she had worked with for years. "What the hell happened? Are you okay?" Words spreading fast. Her stomach twisted. Of course, people were talking. They had probably started talking the moment she had been escorted off the plane. The industry wasn't big. Stories like this traveled fast. She thought about responding, about saying she was fine, about brushing it off, pretending it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But that would be a lie. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she wanted to lie to herself anymore. She shoved the phone back into her pocket and exhaled, lifting her gaze to the skyline. She had a lot to figure out, and she had 6 months to do it. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked. Her feet carried her aimlessly through the city streets, past coffee shops, past groups of people rushing to work, past places that had once felt familiar, but now seemed distant, like she was seeing them through a different lens. The weight in her chest hadn't lessened, and she wasn't sure if it ever would. She kept replaying Malcolm Carter's words in her head. The way he had spoken to her, not with anger, not with contempt, but with a controlled, quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "You thought you were just enforcing rules, but those rules seemed to apply to certain people more than others, didn't they?" She had never questioned herself before, not like this. Her entire career had been built on certainty, on knowing the rules, enforcing them, making sure passengers followed them. She had never thought of herself as unfair. She had never thought of herself as wrong. But now she had to ask herself a question she had spent years avoiding. Had she been blind to her own bias? The realization sat heavy in her stomach, because the truth was, if it had been someone else, if it had been another flight attendant caught in this situation, another crew member making these kinds of snap judgments, she would have been the first to defend the airline's policies. She would have said they were just following procedures. She would have justified it. She would have believed they were doing the right thing. But now, she had no excuses left. Because this time, she had been the one in the wrong. And the only reason she was even getting a second chance was because the man she had humiliated had chosen to give her one. Her breath hitched as she thought about that. Malcolm Carter didn't owe her anything. He could have fired her immediately. He could have made an example out of her, sent a company-wide message, put her name on a blacklist that would keep her from ever working in this industry again. But he hadn't. Instead, he had done something that was, in some ways, much worse. He had made her see herself. And now she had to live with what she saw. She found herself stopping in front of a park bench, her legs aching from walking, her thoughts still tangled. She sat down, rubbing her hands together, staring at the pavement beneath her feet. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was good at her job, that she was fair, that she was professional. But she had never taken a step back to consider the people on the other side of her decisions. The passengers she had questioned, the ones she had assumed didn't belong, the ones who had probably walked off flights before, feeling the same way Malcolm Carter had, powerless, frustrated, exhausted by something they couldn't even prove had happened. She had been so sure that she had been doing the right thing. And now, she didn't know if she had ever really understood what that meant. A cool breeze passed through the park, rustling the trees around her. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. She didn't know what the next 6 months would bring. She didn't know if she would pass the program, if she would ever get her job back, if she even deserved to get it back. But she knew one thing. She wasn't the same person who had walked onto that plane yesterday morning, and she never would be again. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just thinking about the rules. She was thinking about the people. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, scrolling past the missed calls and unread messages from coworkers and friends who were waiting for her response. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened a new message. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard for a moment. Then she typed 2 words. "Thank you." She hit send. Malcolm Carter probably didn't need her gratitude, but she needed to say it, because today was the first day she had truly seen herself, and now she had no choice but to decide what kind of person she was going to become. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about what happened. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.